I think a lot of men today are genuinely lost, and I don't necessarily blame them for it. If you spend enough time on social media, podcasts, or YouTube, you'll find hundreds of different opinions of what it means to be a man. Every person seems convinced they discovered the secret, right? One person tells you to earn more money, another tells you to build as much muscle as possible. Someone else says you should never show emotions, while another insists masculinity itself is outdated. Who needs it, right? When you're constantly surrounded by conflicting advice, it's no surprise so many young men are pulled in a dozen different directions. Instead of having one clear example to follow, they're left trying to piece together their identity from fragments of people they've never even met. The more I've thought about it, the more I've found myself asking a very simple question. If I had to point to one man in all of history who perfectly embodied what masculinity should look like, who would it be? It wouldn't be a billionaire, it wouldn't be an athlete or a celebrity. In fact, it probably wouldn't even be the person you think of first. I hope all would and should think of it first. But my answer would be Jesus Christ. I know that might sound strange to some people because you might be accustomed to other people's opinions of Jesus, but the more time I've spent reading the Gospels, the more I look into the Word of God and the Bible, I'm convinced he has displayed the most complete picture of masculinity I have ever seen. He was humble without lacking confidence, compassionate without being weak, courageous without being reckless, and powerful without ever needing to prove it. One of the first things that stood out to me was that Jesus was a creator, long before he became a teacher. Before crowds gathered around him and before miracles were recorded, he spent years working as a carpenter. He built things with his hands, solved practical problems, and created something useful for other people. I don't think that's an insignificant detail. There's something deeply masculine about building instead of merely consuming. Whether it's building a family, a business, a home, a friendship, or a community, healthy masculinity leaves the world better than I found it. It creates value where there was none before. I sometimes wonder if that's one of the reasons so many men today feel restless. We consume more than any generation before us. We scroll endlessly and absorb endless entertainment, yet many of us rarely create anything ourselves. We were designed to contribute, not simply consume. Something else I've come to admire is the way Jesus used his strength. People often remember the gentle side of Christ, and rightly so. They remember him blessing the children, healing the sick, and showing compassion to those everyone else had rejected. But that isn't the whole picture. The same Jesus who embraced the broken also walked into the temple and drove out all those who had corrupted it. He confronted religious hypocrisy, challenged powerful leaders, and refused to stay silent when God's house was being dishonored. What strikes me is he never sought conflict for his own ego, but neither did he avoid it to simply keep people comfortable. I think that's an important lesson because masculinity isn't about being aggressive, nor is it about being passive. It's about having the wisdom to know when peace should be preserved and when the truth is worth defending. A good man doesn't fight every battle, but neither does he abandon the battle that matters. One of the shortest verses in the entire Bible simply says, Jesus wept. It's only 2 words, yet I think they completely dismantle the idea that masculinity requires emotional detachment. The Son of God cried, not because he lacked strength, but because he loved deeply enough to be moved by the suffering of those around him. Somewhere along the way, we've confused emotional suppression with emotional maturity. We tell young boys to harden themselves, to bottle everything up, and to never let anyone see them struggle. Yet Christ shows us something entirely different. Real strength isn't pretending that nothing affects you. Real strength is having a heart soft enough to love people deeply, while remaining steady enough to carry your responsibilities. There's a world of difference being emotionally controlled and emotionally numb. And I think modern culture often mistakes one from the other. As I continued reading the Gospels, I realized that almost everything Jesus did was directed towards serving other people. Modern culture constantly asks us what we gain. How much money can we earn? How much influence can we build? How many people can admire us? Christ asked an entirely different question. He asked, what could we give? He fed people who couldn't repay him, healed those society had forgotten, washed his disciples' feet, and ultimately laid down his own life for humanity. That's such a radically different picture of leadership than one we've often presented with today. True leadership isn't standing above people demanding to be served. It's being willing to kneel down and serve first. I think somewhere along the way we've confused status with significance. But Jesus reminded us the greatest people are often the ones quietly carrying the greatest burdens for others. Perhaps the quality that has challenged me the most is Jesus' restraint. People often assume masculinity means being intimidating or physically capable, but I think strength without self-control is simply immaturity. There's a remarkable moment when Jesus is arrested, where Peter draws his sword in an attempt to defend him, and Jesus immediately tells him to put it away before explaining that he could call upon more than 12 legions of angels if he wished. Think about what that means. Christ possessed unimaginable power, yet he chose restraint because of violence wasn't the Father's will. That's a completely different definition of strength than the world often celebrates. Anyone can lose their temper. Anyone can lash out when they're offended. Very few people possess genuine strength while also possessing complete control over it. I think that's what the mastery should look like. Another characteristic I believe defines biblical masculinity is courage. Jesus knew exactly what was waiting for him in Jerusalem. He knew he would be betrayed by one of his closest friends, abandoned by many of his followers, mocked, beaten, and crucified. Yet he continued walking towards it because of obedience mattered more than comfort. Courage isn't an absence of fear. It is a willingness to do what is right despite that fear. Every man will eventually reach moments where doing the right thing comes at a personal cost. It might cost you your reputation, your career, your comfort, or your relationships. Those moments reveal who you truly are, because character is rarely formed in comfort. It usually is formed when obedience becomes expensive. The final lesson I kept returning to is responsibility. Everywhere Jesus went, he accepted responsibility for the people around him. He taught those who were searching for the truth. He cared for the vulnerable, healed the sick, and continually placed the needs of others before his own. His life wasn't centered on self-expression or self-fulfillment. It was centered on faithful service. I think responsibility is one of the defining characteristics of mature masculinity because it's rarely glamorous, right? It looks like keeping your word, showing up when you're tired, providing for your family, apologizing when you're wrong, and doing what needs to be done even when nobody notices. It's the quiet decisions repeated over years that shape a man's character far more than the dramatic moments ever will. The more I've reflected on all of this and I continue to read the gospel, the less interested I become in the world's definition of masculinity. I don't think masculinity is measured by how much money you earn, or how loudly you speak, or how intimidating you appear to other people. I think it's measured by the kind of person you become. A man who builds instead of destroys. A man who protects instead of dominates. A man who serves instead of seeks recognition. A man who possesses strength but exercises restraint. A man who has the courage to stand for what is true even when it costs him. Above all, I think masculinity is becoming the kind of man that other people feel safe around because they know your strength exists for their good, not for your own glory. If that's the picture of manhood we're aiming towards, then I honestly don't think history has given us a greater example than Jesus Christ. Whether you're already a Christian or simply someone trying to understand what healthy masculinity looks like, Jesus is definitely worth studying. The world has no shortage of opinions about what a man should be. But I believe God has already shown us the perfect example in the life of his own son.